On this episode of INI9, I have with me Times of India's foreign editor, Chidanand Rajghatta, who's a lot more than just being a foreign editor. One of the Indian institutions in Washington, D.C.
I would say that.
And Chidanand and I are going to, we're sitting in Bangalore and we're going to talk about US-Pakistan relations, where they are now and where they are sort of headed. So, Chidanand, lots of things have happened in 2011, right? So, what's the scene now? Where do US-Pakistan relations stand?
It doesn't stand. It's actually collapsing. It's derailed. It's dysfunctional. It's collapsing and disintegrating actually. And the only thing to look at now is whether they manage to retrieve the situation and get it back on the rails, on its legs. It's a sad story because for the longest time this is a relationship that's been built on a lot of fiction and a lot of romance. Going back to the 70s and 80s, as you know, Pakistan was a much touted ally. The United States, in its enthusiasm to both counter and push back their perception of a Soviet expansion, of a communist expansion into South Asia and Southeast Asia, propped up the state, which at that point was pretty close to having carried out one of the largest genocides in human history, which people tend to forget. In 1971, this was a state that killed almost 1 million of their own countrymen at that point, East Pakistanis or Bengalis. They were in the doghouse, they were in the international doghouse, and by some miracle the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan actually made Pakistan a very important state, and all was forgotten and forgiven, to the extent that the United States also slept on Pakistan developing a nuclear weapon. This is the background of how Pakistan got out of jail, so to speak. And then for the next 10 years, from 1978 to 1988, pretty much, they feasted on American largesse and were at that point the most allied ally. And there was much romance attached to it. As you know, there were congressmen, senators, lawmakers, lobbyists who propped up the state and funded it and made it a sort of bulwark against the so-called Soviet expansion.
Now let's take it now. Let's
this is just the historical background.
Now let's look at the 90s, where the argument was that the US broke ties or cooled ties with Pakistan, and now we are in a similar situation where they're going to break ties, or the ties have already broken. Now, what is it that happened in the 90s which the argument is that in the 90s they broke ties and it led to 9/11. So is this in store? Is this kind of a thought process in store in the United States, which says that, look, if we let go of these guys, we're going to have another extremely bad incident?
Well, there's the Pakistani narrative, there's the American narrative, and the truth is somewhere in between, actually. So what happened in the 90s, essentially there was the Pressler Law, I don't know if your viewers would know the background of that, which was actually conceived as an instrument to help the Pakistanis, right? And which said that if the Pakistanis are found to have crossed the Rubicon or crossed the red line in terms of making nuclear weapons, there'd be sanctions imposed on them. And the US used that to actually wink at the Pakistani development of nuclear weapons. And of course, when the Soviet Union withdrew and the sort of the Cold War ended, the Pakistani narrative is that the United States deserted Pakistan at that point in time and punished Pakistan. But the Pressler Amendment actually was conceived as an instrument to help Pakistan. And naturally, when the war ended or the Soviets withdrew, the laws kicked in, and the United States and President George Bush at the time, the elder Bush, found no reason to protect this, essentially what was a client state. the law kicked in, and I won't say the punishment was exemplary. I mean, there's this whole episode of F-16, and again, the Pakistani narrative is that, oh, we paid money and they didn't give us a plane, which is not necessarily true. A lot of it was aid money.
And money is fungible anyway.
Money is fungible, and the Pakistanis knew when they paid the money that this provision was there in the books.
Right.
So it was coming, and I don't particularly buy the Pakistani narrative of being deserted by the US. I mean, what do you expect, that the United States would coddle you forever? I mean, the Pakistanis needed to grow up at that point in time. But what happened at that point of time also, and this is important for what you said about the growth of Al-Qaeda and the Pakistanis going down the fundamentalist route, was that Zia had already been in power for several years, and when he died, he had already instituted in place all the instruments it took to turn Pakistan into a fundamentalist state. Right? And between 88, when Zia died in August 1788, and between the 92-93 time frame, when you first started hearing of all these, the so-called Mujahideen having, turned into what Pakistanis now like to call non-state actors. Those 5 years resulted in, you could see the results of Zia's 10-year experiment, which was the fundamentalization of the Pakistani army. The Beards had come to power, and if you remember, the United States had to intervene to get a couple of Pakistani generals sacked, and including an ISI chief. So that process continued till 92-93, and then sadly, and I say sadly because everyone thinks so highly of the Clinton years, like the golden years for the United States, the boom time, roaring 90s, the internet came, and technology companies, it was a birth of a lot of great technologies, and the United States, literally sort of expand. But what also happened in those crucial 8 years was the US was asleep on the watch. Al-Qaeda grew. Osama bin Laden moved from Sudan to Afghanistan. Everybody was asleep on the watch. And in 98, and there were several terrorist attacks, if you remember, starting with 1993, the first attack on the World Trade Center on, I think, February 26, 93. And then followed by others,
Kenya and other things.
Kenya, Tanzania, USSR. There were plenty of terrorist attacks happened, and sadly, I think they tried to take out Osama bin Laden one time with the coast bombing in 1998, where again ISI officials were killed in that bombing. There were several Pakistani terrorists who were killed. But it just didn't grab the imagination or the attention of American policymakers, much less American public. And everyone continued to see
in that sense,
9/11.
That's right. In the sense that it's not, I think the narrative tries to push it to say that, if we let Pakistan go, if we let them, if we cut Pakistan loose, you're likely to face another 9/11. The answer is not so much that you cut Pakistan loose and go to sleep, but if once you cut Pakistan loose, you have a responsibility to ensure that these guys are not up to something funny. Because when they were up to something funny in the 90s, you guys are not on the scene, right? Either you were closing one eye, or you're thinking that it's not as serious as it seems to be, or firing missiles as a way to politically solve the problem to your domestic constituents, as opposed to actually substantively get to the root of the problem.
Right. Again, I have a problem with this whole thing of the United States deserted Pakistan. What do you expect? I mean, that the Pakistan needs to be coddled and nursed for the rest of its life. I mean, come on, why don't they become a 51st state instead? Right. So at some point, Pakistan had a chance to get on the right track and make itself a state which its founder apparently visualized. But they did not, and they kept going down this fundamentalist route with frequent interventions with the army. And then Kargil happened in 99, which was entirely an army. It was something pushed by the Pakistani military. And from then on, it was a downhill slide. I personally think it's reached a stage where it's very hard to retrieve and turn around this state, which has just chosen confrontation as the lifeblood of its existence.